Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. K.L. Kaufman, who is a graduate of Purdue University and received his Ph.D. from Ohio State. He taught at the Washington State Medical College of Virginia, and in 1949 started teaching at Butler University in the College of Pharmacy. He's been a dean at Butler in the College of Pharmacy since 1952. He's chairman of the International Science Fair Council, a member and treasurer of the Marion County Heart Association, and chairman of the Pharmaceutical Subcommittee for the American Cancer Society. And his achievements go on for about 3 paragraphs more, but I'm sure you'd much rather listen to him. So, Dr. Kaufman.
I appreciate that, and I told her to make it short, and then she tells me that it's so long, but you have to blame that on a faithful secretary who sends all that stuff out. I enjoy being here. I like to talk about quackery. I hope that I will be of some slight help to you in due course. I recognize there's a possibility of some slight repetition too, the second week of a workshop like this. But if I see you glaring at me as though it's old hat, I will quickly change the subject. I am here because of the Speakers Bureau, the American Cancer Society, and I hasten to add, in view of the fact that this is Muncie and Dr. Montgomery this morning mentioned Delaware County, that the American Cancer Society is not a United Fund organization, and yet as teachers and scholars I think it deserves a lot more support and a lot less backknifing from various people who operate United Funds, and this is not an opposition to the United Funds. I hope somebody asks me about that and takes me to task for it a little later. Well, as this day of reckoning approached, I saw a sort of a parallel in something a fellow told me the other day about his little daughter. She's a 3rd or 4th grader, I believe, and he noticed that suddenly one night she was surrounded with papers and books and seemed to be working very hard, and she said, and so Daddy, of course, said, "Honey, is this all a homework job?" And, "Oh, yes." Says, "Well, what is your assignment that you're working so hard?" Says, "I am doing a complete report on the condition of the world." He says, "My, that's a big assignment for a little girl." She says, "Oh, don't worry, Dad. We got 3 of us working on it." As I got closer to today, I thought maybe I needed 3 people and 3 days, perhaps, to really cover this subject. Well, you may have heard already, last week, the old expression that he who goes to the quack engages a fool for a doctor. I'd like to say it a little differently. He who goes to the quack plays the fool. Or maybe still another way, one in fact which I like very much, is what Voltaire said a long, long time ago. I think he got both those and more into a single sentence when he said, "The first quack was born when the first knave met the first fool." And the reason he got more, you see, is that this quack is going to be around for a long, long time, unless you're complete Pollyanna and believe that we're suddenly not going to have no more knaves or fools. Now, some people resent the use of the term fool, but let's face it, when we get to a state of mind that leads us to a quack, we're playing the fool, and this is true whether the illness is real or imaginary. I just wonder if you've ever stopped to think what makes cancer quackery perhaps a little different, or at least the reactions a little different than most other types. It's summed up in one word, and that's fear. Have you ever really thought? Have you ever really known, in fact, any cancer patient and understood that gnawing fear, that horrible, hideous despair, that nearly insane desire to try just anything. This, I submit, is something that occurs to a greater degree in quackery than in cancer quackery than anywhere else. The quack reads that there'll be 500,000 new cases this year, maybe some 14 or 15,000 in Indiana. That only 1 out of 3 presently are being cured. That the 49 million of the people now living will one day be showing some signs of cancer in these United States. So he fears. He doesn't even remember or let it soak into his consciousness that the quack, or that there are some exciting breakthroughs apparently very near. He doesn't even know that we could even now cure 1 out of 2 instead of 1 out of 3 if they got to them quickly enough. There are still people I've discovered who fear quackery, or who fear cancer as in terms of a social stigma, that it's something unclean. Much the way we used to talk about venereal disease, and still do. There are people who fear the expense. There are people who fear the standard treatments. They may have known somebody who went through the colostomy bit or the laryngectomy, and how they've had to learn to talk, or how they've had to get accustomed to that little pouch on their side with all its attendant troubles. Or they may have known somebody who's had the massive x-ray or cobalt treatments and seen the skin burns on their chests. And this is very scary. But I think the greatest fear of all, perhaps, that the cancer person gets, and the thing that leads him quicker to the quack, is the fear, justified or not, that the physician has given up hope. If he's only a hypochondriac who's been told he doesn't have cancer, the physician's covering up to save his feelings, he thinks. If he does have cancer and the physician is frank and says you've got a 50-50 chance to make it, well, he's letting me down easy. That despair, that lack of hope is so important to him. And where can he find hope? At the home of the quack. And it's one of the things that drives him there more quickly. The quack has also helped more in cancer, I suppose, than in any other field, by the powerful friends that he develops, sometimes without even knowing them personally. As long ago as 1748, the House of Burgesses of the colony of Virginia heard of a Mary Johnson who had, quote, a receipt of curing cancer, end quote. Mary Johnson was sought by a committee duly appointed, the members of this House. And in the course of time, they reported back, as directed, that yes, they had found Mary Johnson. She did have a cure for cancer. They believed indeed that it worked. She was good enough to give them the formula. And how lucky they were. Upshot. This distinguished group of gentlemen, including no less personages than George Washington and James Madison, promptly showed their gratitude by voting Mrs. Johnson 100 English pounds as a reward. You want to see a picture of it? coming up here. There it is. And here is the directions for making it. The few plant materials in there are now considered to have no pharmacologic value, but anyhow you can follow it, and this is why they gave the woman in gratitude the 100 pounds sterling. You might smile bitterly and say it was kind of a bitter, sad joke on them, but it was 200 years ago. We wouldn't be fooled that way now. But wait a minute. In 1963, just 4 years ago, after the National Cancer Institute had reported that their best investigation had shown carbazin can be completely worthless, the recent senator from our neighboring state, Paul Douglas, introduced a resolution into the Senate which would have directed the National Institutes of Health to do a restudy according to the procedures recommended by Durovic and Ivy, which were quite unscientific. This resolution laid over till 64, and during that time it collected 56 co-sponsors. That's a lot of co-sponsors in any subject in Congress. And it darn near passed. Cancer has powerful friends. But they don't all come from the political life. When I was a kid, one of my favorite silent movie stars of the opposite sex, and I learned about girls fairly early. I don't know much about them, but I learned about the difference. Anyhow, one of my favorite silent movie stars was Gloria Swanson. For the last 10 or 20 years, she has been active in a not-for-profit foundation which functions primarily to promote quackery, and including cancer quackery. And they come from the business world too. Richard Aldrich, the husband of the late Gertrude Lawrence, was, I believe, a banker. He founded the Gertrude Lawrence Foundation, put in some money, and assigned all the royalties of the biographical book about her to the support of this foundation, and in turn this foundation supports one of the quacks I'll tell you about in a little bit. So they have powerful friends. Now, in passing, it should be noted that these people, particularly the congressmen, have another way of helping them, and Douglas wasn't the only one. They often put into the congressional record remarks, as they're called, on various subjects. And Douglas, former Senator Langer, Representative Lebanati of New York, and others have frequently put remarks into the congressional record promoting one or more forms of quackery. Then the proponents of the quack procedures or medicines take this reprints of the congressional record and show it to people and say, look, even the government recognizes that this is a great advance, which of course is completely untrue. It doesn't mean anything except that some congressman or senator put it there. But it's a form of advertising, and without advertising, no quack can succeed, as you've probably heard. However, he doesn't need to have a friend in the Congress. The quack needs only one or two people who are convinced to start talking about his product or his procedure to develop a lot of advertising. He gets word-of-mouth advertising. It's better than he could buy, and he probably couldn't buy mass media advertising for some of his claims. You probably are aware of a study that was published from Iowa State a few years ago in which they tried to determine what led people to notice, to get interested in, to try a new product. And they discovered that while in most cases in their study, the mass media were the best sources of first information, first bringing it to the people's attention. They discovered that while this was true, when one went on a little further and got to the point of being interested and deciding to try it, they discussed it with their friends and neighbors. And the friends and neighbors were principally responsible, in the majority of cases, for them to make the trial. And this without regard to their competency to judge. The two other things, very quickly, that I'd like to remind you about, and which are essential to a successful quack promotion, are, of course, the placebo effect and the remissions phenomenon. I think you all know probably that a placebo, by definition, is an inert substance that is given as a supposed medication. There are places for it in medicine. Most people say, well, this doesn't make very good sense as they hear it described for the first time, because obviously if a medicine doesn't have any activity, I would know it. If I have a headache and you tell me you're giving me an aspirin but give me a placebo, I will know it. Don't be too sure. A study, I think one of the best studies ever done, recently, or a few years ago in the East Coast, they told a bunch of arthritics that they thought they had discovered a real new fine cure for arthritis. And they gave them placebos to determine the effect. 1/3 of those arthritics reported happily that they got relief for periods up to 3 months on a placebo, inert material. Even more striking, about half that many got relief for periods up to 6 months. But the real stopper in the story was the 5 or 6%, I forget which, who brought the material back to the investigators within a few days or a week and said, this medicine is simply too potent, I can't take it. So don't kid yourself that placebos don't have effects. We want them to work, and they will. Sometimes. Then remissions. All chronic ailments are characterized by these unpredictable periods of remission in which the patient finds the symptoms abated or even completely stopped unexpectedly for varying periods of time. No one knows how to predict the onset of a remission or its duration. That doesn't matter. Suppose you're falling into the hands of a quack just when you're going to have a remission. Who gets the credit? If you're John Q. Public. The quack does, and his treatment. Now, as people interested in teaching, I know it would be nice to say, I've got to get on with some attempt to categorize materials here. It would be nice to say that we could put everything about cancer quackery in a bunch of convenient little slots, catalog it neatly. This, it seems to me, is impossible unless we make a terribly, terribly long list that would get down to the point of nearly naming the product, the different forms of quackery. Quackery in cancer has included every kind of approach, and very often it's a mixture. So what I will try to say here is, in the next few minutes, to give you a description of, with examples, of a very limited classification, but you must understand at the outset that it's quite unsatisfactory, and the very first one will help to illustrate that. If One convenient way is to start with the escharotics or corrosives. I'm sure this group would be familiar with corrosives, but I'm not sure you knew escharotics. The man in recent years who has been most successful with this and has only recently been finally put out of business is Hoxsey. Now, right away we get into trouble because this is really a combination for most of his patients. Hoxsey, however, made more use than any other modern American quack of corrosive materials. He used trichloroacetic acid, one of the most corrosive chemicals, depending on concentration and length of contact, that you can find. He used zinc chloride, pretty corrosive. He used arsenic and antimony sulfides, pastes, which could be pretty corrosive in prolonged contact. Admittedly, he put it mostly on the outside. Now, the reason it isn't a very satisfactory classification is because he always used with them some internal medicines, usually made up of plant materials, which we would regard today, plant extracts, which we would regard today as having practically no pharmacologic effects, and potassium iodide, which does have some pharmacologic effect. And then he talked a lot in the later years of his promotion about supportive treatment. Quacks always try to update their quackery to make it seem in tune with current science, even though it is still unscientific. So he had really three parts to most of his treatment: the corrosives, the internal medicines, the supportives. The supportives at first were iron and vitamins. Then he got to adding, for many cases, and maybe as part of a ritual to make the patients feel that they were getting individual attention, he frequently added antacids or laxatives or both, things that wouldn't have too much effect otherwise. But, of course, the public is aware of the vitamin and iron deficiency through those horrible commercials for tired blood and that kind of stuff. I like to make cracks about those things, but I don't have really time. One of the saddest things about this is that although both the Hoxsey clinics in Pennsylvania and Texas are closed, and I believe the old fellow has finally died, leaving a few successors around, even though they're closed, the so-called health magazines, in many instances, are carrying ads for the herbs that he put in the internal medications. And they're telling the formulas that Hoxsey supposedly used. So there must be people today still using the Hoxsey treatment and wasting their money and keeping themselves away from the person who might be able to help them. This is the saddest part of cancer quackery, because once you fall in their hands, you're usually with them too long for any real hope of being saved later. You've just given nature time to make your case a fatal one. He promoted his procedure in large part by a book called You Don't Have to Die. I've never seen a figure on the total number of copies sold, but it's estimated in the hundreds of thousands at a good price. And the book was designed to get business for his clinics, where he got from $300 to $400 per patient for telling them to put this gunk on their hide and for telling them to swallow the other part. For a long time, the Food and Drug Administration couldn't get a hold of him. They needed a certain interpretation of one part of the law. When they got this about 10 years ago, and he saw that he would have a new enemy to face, he'd been outwitting the postal laws pretty well. He stepped up his radio programs, which was one of his approaches, but more importantly, he scored a sort of a first among the scoundrels who prey on the cancer victims. He got a bunch of other well-known quacks in various fields to join him in a sort of a lecture circuit. And they went out and gave lectures on science and health. Quote, science and health. They weren't scientific, and it wouldn't be good for your health. But the people who heard it didn't know it. It was a beautifully planned attempt to get the Food and Drug Administration under pressure from an aroused public. So much for that. Let's look at another group. The second category, Mary Johnson's receipt. Of course, I'm talking about plant products. And of course, hers was really primarily plant products. Here's another one. This one, I don't know whether... An island plant. So this is another plant product, and this was typical stuff that was being promoted at the turn of the century. I would call your attention to two or three things about it. First of all, it appeals to women, the fright that they suffer from frequent non-malignant swellings in the breast. Now, this is about 50 years old. Of course, they didn't have any microorganism, but almost anyone who could read knew of the new science, still comparatively new science, bacteriology. And people had all kinds of ideas of what these little microorganisms were like. An octopus style was a pretty good one for average lay person. And this, without saying so, was, I'm told, interpreted by many people who had a tendency to be a little scared, was interpreted as probably a cancer organism. Notice that any lump in a woman's breast is cancer. That was an outright lie. The laws weren't good enough to stop that. Write to Dr. and Mrs. Shamble. Use the doctor's name. And more than that, $1,000 if I can't cure it. It said that some of the relatives of deceased patients filed suit against Shambles, but that in every case his defense was they didn't take it properly. And he got away with it. So he made his pile. But I would suggest that among the newer plant products, probably the best known is the one described in this little book, Laetrile. Actually, this has a pretty long ancestry, but it got a revival and a new lease on life just a few years ago. This book, for example, was copyrighted in 1963, and I think you can still find it in many newsstands. Back in 1902, a Scottish physician by the name of Beard had a theory that on the causation of cancer that was revived by three men, a father and two sons, some 10 or 15 years ago. These were the Krebs family. Father Krebs was an MD. One son was an osteopath, and the other son called himself a biochemist, although he was a little vague on several occasions about his educational background. The basis, though, is really nearly 60 years, some 60 years old now. The name comes from the fact that they originally got it from the apricot kernel, got their material, and everyone knows, every chemist knows, that this kernel contains a glycoside or glucoside called amygdalin, that it is levorotatory, that is, it rotates the plane of polarized light to the left, and that chemically the agricone, or the non-sugar part of the glycoside, is a mandel-nitriol. So, I better put a little light back on there. We took the first three and the last five, you got white trio. Now, the fellow who wrote this book was not one of the Krebs, but he was under their influence pretty strongly, obviously. And the burden of the book is that now what the Krebs have really done in reviving this old idea from the Scottish position is to make this stuff safe for injection. Now, some of you will know probably that nitriol is a cyanide, is an organic cyanide, and that in contact with an acidic medium, a nitriol will liberate HCN. And you also know, I suppose, that HCN is one of the most powerful and quickest poisons we have. But their theory was that their refined new product that the Krebs family developed would not decompose except when it got to a tumor cell where a certain enzyme would break it up and liberate the hydrocyanic acid within the cell, thereby stopping the cell respiration and, of course, killing it. Thereby, the person becomes cured of cancer. Well, this is a pretty good sounding idea, and a lot of people tried it out, but it didn't work. Incidentally, the Krebs also helped to found two foundations to promote this. They called one in San Francisco the Beard Memorial Foundation, after the Scottish man of 1902 who had first given them this idea, and the other one is in Canada and promotes the distribution of this stuff in Canada. It's called the McNaughton Foundation. Well, so plant products, and these are just a little bit about some fairly current examples. Let's look at another type of cancer quackery that has a tremendous appeal. It's cheap. The materials are often very easily accessible. And you don't have to know much to form a theory. And that's the diet treatments. Probably they're the oldest form of cancer quackery, and maybe of any other kind of quackery. And it's hard to make a choice here. I will choose. I'm going to talk mostly about the grape diet, but I can't resist mentioning the Gerson diet. Gerson was an MD, and you may have read about it fairly recently. Gerson was the guy who had his patients drinking vegetable juices, the juice of fresh liver from calves, and taking coffee enemas. Now this seems to me is not the way to enjoy my coffee. But anyway, That's all I'm going to say about it. I think equally fantastic was the grape diet. And I want to point out something else, though, before I describe it. Diets are a wonderful thing for the drugless type practitioner to use, the chiropractor and the naturopath, who isn't allowed to use drugs. If he can tie some useful procedure into the dietary regimen, or if he can just give them a dietary ritual to follow, it will help to hold. The people who fall for this are the folks who feel that they have to go to the spas, the mineral springs, take the waters, as the saying goes. The ones who patronize the health food stores. And I better say something about that to avoid an argument later. I usually say so-called health food stores. I want to make it clear that by this I mean that if you buy your raisins at the supermarket or the health food store, you still get raisins with essentially the same nutritive value. And as long as you buy stuff at the health food store with that understanding and not expecting it to do things that the same food wouldn't do from the supermarket down the street, then it's your business. If you want to pay the difference, that's all right. You can recognize also many quack promoters who have the diet ideas by the rather interesting way in which they want to, you can recognize these people with the dietary ideas by the almost 100% way in which they endorse organic foods, organically grown, they will say. And here is America's greatest disciple of this. You may have seen this article about a year ago, I guess it was, or maybe less, in which I thought they gave him a beautiful title. This is as Mr. Rodale of Emmaus, Pennsylvania. One of his publications is Prevention Magazine. It's practically the Bible of the health food faddists today, with a reported circulation of more than 300,000. I will show you an index page later about that. Well, to get back to the diet, probably the biggest promotion that any diet has had in this generation, cancer quackery in America, was the grape diet. And it was promoted by a woman, I believe she was German, who came to this country in the 20s. Her name was Johanna Braun. And this lady always made a big point of her degrees, which might interest you. She signed herself as ND, which was Doctor of Naturopathy, and she claimed that PhN was an honorary degree from the naturopaths that meant philosopher of naturopathy. And then she always used AM, and I have yet to discover, maybe I haven't really looked too hard, whether that was an honest, normal academic degree or not. But whether she had any good degrees or not, she wrote a book in 1928 about the grape cure, G-R-A-P-E, not G-R-E-A-T, although she called it G-R-E-A-T. That book went through more than 20 editions until about 1957, when she got out of the picture. Now, the burden of her theory that she propounded was that grapes themselves by themselves are notably loaded with medicinal qualities. But the trouble is we mix them in our stomachs with other foods and with medicines, and we in effect turn them into poisons. Thereby they lose their medicinal value. In fact, they're not even good for us unless we're very careful with what we mix. And she said also such things, or she stressed such things as her belief that grape is a powerful antiseptic. It's a powerful solvent of degenerative tissue. Thereby it ought to be good for curing cancer, I guess. And she had a beautiful ritual with this, which is probably part of the reason people stuck to it. We started out with 7 meals a day, grapes and water. Repeat 6 times. The second stage, she allowed them to add a few other fruits and some sour milk. It still doesn't get very good sounding to me. In the third stage, they could have a few raw vegetables, along with, of course, their continued fruits and grapes. And only in the final stage would she allow them to go to a regular cooked meal, but it had to be accompanied by the raw vegetables of the third stage, and it had to be accompanied by the grapes. Where one found an external cancer on the skin, she also recommended that poultices or compresses of grapes be made. I can just picture a lot of these beautifully purple people. But this, she even went further. For other appropriate areas of the body, she recommended enemas and douches of grapes. She had an outfit in New York she called the Harmony Healing Center. People came there in droves for 30-odd years and followed her regimen and looked to her as a sort of a little goddess. In fact, one of her chief fans was the great physical culturist Bernard McFadden. Some of you may be too young to remember that, but he was like Mr. Atlas, you know, in the ads, and he was also a food fetishist. And this is probably why Dr. Brandt's ideas appealed to him. It made the very interesting thing, he got so excited over the great cure for cancer that he once stated that he would give $10,000 to anyone who could prove that grapes did not cause cancer. You know, that old boy was a pretty shrewd businessman, and I'm not so sure about what he was doing, a little like Dr. Goddard's doing at the Food and Drug Administration nowadays, and putting the burden of proof on the other guy, that you're guilty until proven innocent, sort of thought. But at any rate, Bernard McFadden was one of her disciples. Well, I got to get on here because I'm running way over. Fourth category would be the devices. And there's a blue million of these things. I've got one here that I'll tell you about after, but I've got some slides of a couple of them. I have to get some light on them. This is orgone. Dr. Wilhelm Reich, an Austrian, started out to be a psychiatrist, disciple of Freud. Found himself suddenly ousted from his professional society in Austria, went to Norway, and a couple of years later, wonder of wonders, discovered that there was in the atmosphere a bluish, ethereal type material that everybody else in the world had overlooked, a material which was essential to healthy protoplasm, and he called it orgone. Now this was in the mid-30s. just at a time, I think, by something more than coincidence, that the average layman was beginning to add the word hormone to his vocabulary. Made it sound more scientific. Well, Dr. Ike then came over to the United States and set up a place in Rangeley, Maine. And he wrote about the science that he called orgonomy and orgone. Now, most of his stuff, his writings had seemed to be designed to interest the person who is concerned with sexual prowess. And I suppose we ought to take a small bit of gratitude in saying that we'll have to admit he didn't claim to cure every kind of cancer under every condition. He said that he couldn't cure cancer in the liver and brain, and he only would recommend his methods for the cure of early stages of other cancers. According to him, when he did write on cancer, cancer cells were really protozoa, and they were caused by what he called bions. Another term he used for bions was energy vesicle. Energy vesicle. He said it came from deteriorating tissue. Well, maybe so. Everything he described about a bion, except his terminology, would make most scientists think of bacteria. But anyhow, he had this different idea. Now, the way he applied his orgonomy then to cancer was that since cancer cells were like protozoa but had a tail and could move about like fish, he said. This is from an MD. He said, really, of course, we would die. We would turn into a hopeless blob of protozoa if we didn't die before that by stopping other things. So we would use these energy accumulators, and here are three types. He also had a king-size one, as big as a wardrobe room. This thing, I could never resist saying that the person who bought his ideas would have, if they bought that conical shaped one, would have something that would be appropriate to them. And doesn't have. This he called a shooter box. It has nothing inside except the lining of metal, and the big accumulator, trunk size, was big enough for a person to sit in, a little bit uncomfortable. He claimed it had to be kept small in size because he wanted the patient to have all parts of the body close to the lining. I tried one out at the Food and Drug Administration one time, and I can say you get warm and uncomfortable pretty quickly, but I don't think that I was accumulating any of this bluish, mysterious bluish stuff that made my protoplasm any healthier. Well, anyhow, that was one of the current recent examples on that. Here's one. This was called the beryllium tube. It's just a little thing about as big as a 10-penny nail with the ring on it, which you can pin it to your clothing. The cap unscrews, and inside is some barium chloride. And while this, like many other things, was sold to sufferers from more than one type of ailment, including arthritic people, it really is a revival of a very old idea. Mankind has long wanted to be able to pull disease out through the skin, or to push things through the skin inward to drive disease out. Back in the Revolutionary War days, a fellow by the name of Elisha Perkins came out with two big spike-like things, or two different metals. And he said, he called them Perkins metallic trackers. He said, if you'll draw these over the area of inflammation or disease and do it often enough, the disease will be gone. One of his customers was George Washington, a fact which he was not bashful about telling other prospective customers. But you see, this is a modern representative of the same idea, that the beryllium tube, as it's called here, would draw the ailment through the skin, only this was very thoughty of these producers to put a little loop on it so you could pin it on. And I could tell you an interesting story about a famous arthritic who had one of those stolen from him. But I better get on. A fifth category that I'd like to give you revolves around the idea that acids and alkalis must be in balance in the body in order for us to have health. Well, you know, this wasn't. Paracelsus and his cohorts weren't far from this idea, and they weren't necessarily quacks. And there have been, from time to time, people come forward with variations on this theme. The one I would tell you about is a man still living and practicing medicine in New York City. His name is Revici, R-E-V-I-C-I, Romanian born, I believe, or Hungarian, I'm not sure which. He got his MD in his native country. He eventually came to Mexico and set up there as the scientific director of an Institute of Applied Biology. He was the founder, the boss, everything. Well, evidently, he thought there'd be better pickings, and he managed to get into New York. And in spite of some strong efforts by reputable people, the man now has practice privileges in several hospitals in addition to the one that his institute operates. This is the fellow who gets the money from Richard Aldrich's book about Gertrude Lawrence. That's part of his support. But anyhow, in this particular man's theory, it's the lipids that have to be watched the most for health, and particularly for cancer. These fatty materials that we call the lipids, he said, in many cases really have acid or alkaline reactions, and therefore, after appropriate diagnosis, one would know which way the reaction was going from normal and would counteract it, just as we neutralize acid with base or base with acid. He diagnosed primarily by the points of pain and the hydrogen ion concentration of urine and tissues. And while he talked so much about lipicides, a category of chemicals which apparently no one else really knows, he actually uses a lot of different acidic or alkaline materials. Well, now you could take any of those 5 categories and say, as I did with the first one, that many quacks use combinations. They use combinations of the 5 that I've told you. They use combinations also with biological products. But I've saved that as my 7th one for a reason that's probably obvious. The Gibson method, for example, is one of the fairly current combination methods. He takes sometimes carbazin along with several other disproved products or methods and says that he gets better results by using combination. Or you could take something as old and as simple and as grandmotherish as the old idea that existed in many parts of the world that cobwebs and arsenic made a good combination to treat cancer. Spider webs, cobwebs and spider. But I'd like to spend most of the rest of the time now about carbazin. Everybody's heard so much of it, it's hard for me at least to guess exactly where to begin. So I have to try a little quick rundown of the story. You probably know carbazin was the alleged discovery of 2 Yugoslav brothers one an MD, one a lawyer. They were in Argentina a number of years before coming to this country about 1949. While in Argentina, they claimed that they were experimenting with the injection of horses with one of the actinomycetes. I think it's actinomycete bovis, the one that causes lumpy jaw in cattle. And that somehow they discovered that the blood from horses which had been injected with this was able to treat cancers, and that they had a really earth-shaking discovery. So they came to the U.S., specifically to Chicago, got in touch with Dr. Andrew Ivy, who was the then Vice President for Medical Sciences, the University of Illinois. And unquestionably, Ivy was a scientist of high repute. I can tell you now, I'm not going to be able to answer exactly what happened to him. I have my theories, but something happened. And meanwhile, shortly after arriving here, they claimed that they had refined their method of production. They could make the stuff not only from the whole blood, but from the plasma. They could also make it even from frozen meat. They claimed that it was a lipopolysaccharide. This would be a molecule you see having a fatty moiety and a polysaccharide moiety. You probably remember that the Food and Drug Administration, after a very careful sampling a few years ago, proved that the only thing in it except the mineral oil was creatine, a normal constituent of every cell and one completely without pharmacologic effects. This in spite of the lipopolysaccharide. Interestingly enough, the contents of these ampules, and it was always sold in ampule form and injected, contents varied from time to time. Up till 1960, no analyst, and there were several around the country, including government agencies, who tried to analyze it, no analyst found anything but pure, light mineral oil. Along about 1963, and just before they hit this creatine thing, they found traces of amyl alcohol and phenylenediamine in it. And then they found that it had creatine. I think a lot of our confusion about this stems from a variety of things. Let's do a little more history. In 1951, with the help of Dr. Ivy, the Durovic brothers and Ivy pulled off a big press conference at the Drake Hotel in Chicago. They had not published any clinical material about their cures, but they had all sorts of cures of cancer to talk about at that press conference. They had more lay people there than physicians. They then set up 3 organizations which helped to confuse matters further, I suppose. There was the Carbazin Research Foundation, which originally was set up presumably to furnish investigational samples to MDs, although it got pretty stingy with them, and it began insisting on, quote, contributions, end quote, of $9.50 per ampule, and requests for investigational material or for treatment material of patients went usually through this Carbazin Research Foundation. Then there was the Ivy Cancer Research Foundation, which Dr. Ivy headed, and which he said was to investigate these lipopolysaccharides that the Durovic talked about, but that nobody's ever found in the ampule. And then there was the Promac Laboratories, P-R-O-M-A-K. Promac Laboratories was the production arm of the deal. And so even though samples were often distributed through the foundation, Promac was the producer. Now remember, there were 1951, a very unorthodox way for scientists of any kind to introduce a discovery of the magnitude claimed. A press conference with more lay people than scientists or medical men either. And they kept repeating and adding to their claims periodically, mostly through the lay press. And when it became evident that it was going to be hard to get adequate samples, and they would never even get information about the exact procedures of making the stuff, they finally decided to run down all the cases they could. If Ivy and Durovic said that Mrs. Jones at such an address had been a cancer patient of theirs and been some competent investigator went to see about it. Now, of the thousands that they tried to run down in order to get adequate data, incidentally, Durovic and Ivy never gave adequate data on any of the cases, what would be the standard of professional procedure. Out of these thousands of cases, they said finally that there were 1,526 on which they maybe, with a very loose interpretation of standards, maybe had enough information available that they could make a judgment. And they were giving them every benefit of the doubt, I feel. 1,526. They finally assembled a lot of data. Incidentally, in doing this, they discovered a lot of people were dead by the time they were announced in the press, to the press. But among those, they could run down. They finally decided on that number. Out of that 1,526, there were 3 cases that might have represented some regression of the tumor. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you would get probably more than that in spontaneous regressions in any group of 1,526 cancer patients. Now, all the studies were finally reviewed by a blue ribbon committee of medical men and scientists thoroughly familiar with cancers, a group of 24. And not one of that 24 could see any reason to dissent from the unanimous opinion that carbazin was worthless. But of course, the promoters and the friends who thought they had been helped would not sit still for this. And along in 1964 then came what I think was a very major tactical error by the government. They got indictments against Durovic and Ivy on 57 counts. These included such things as violation of Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, mail fraud, mislabeling, false statements to government officers, conspiracy. Not one had to do, you see, with the efficiency of the product. And this is a point that many folks overlook. I think, though, they made a mistake because a subject so charged with emotion, the very fact that they brought 57 counts at once went against them. Even so, this case was tried before a jury. And the jury was out 8 days, during which they reportedly told the judge on almost daily that they considered themselves hopelessly deadlocked, and he reportedly said, go back and unlock and get a decision. And there is a rumor among people who should be knowledgeable that there is presently an investigation, a quiet investigation on about jury tampering. I probably shouldn't say that, except I saw a little hint of it in a filler in a good journal recently. You see, you're being persecuted if that nasty old government who's been keeping you from marketing this stuff the way in normal patterns throws 57 counts at you in the same indictment. That's where I think they made a horrible mistake. It gave the proponents of Kerbiasin another emotional appeal. There's more to it than that. The Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Food and Drug laws require that any new drug, when it gets ready for clinical trial, must be covered by an NDA. An IND. That means investigational new drug application. Now these are not hard to get, provided only that one can show that they have done some good preliminary testing and know the safety ranges in smaller animals. When Durovic in '64 finally filed an application for this IND and was told he would have to give certain information, he withdrew his application for the IND. The proponents of Kerbiasin keep saying that he was forced to. He wasn't. He just didn't want to meet the requirements that other people. Now the thing that seems to me, at least in a circumstantial way, just about completes the chain of evidence, was that for one 3-year period, Dr. Stephen Durovic, the MD, has a government suit against him for $904,000 plus in back income taxes. It has not been disputed, so far as I know, that he has put substantial amounts of money during his years in Chicago into Canadian and Swiss banks. All of a sudden, when the grand jury was discussing a second tax indictment on him, he disappears. Pretty soon somebody discovers he's in Switzerland. And he said he hurried away by direct flight from Chicago to Switzerland because he discovered he had TB and he wanted to get it cured, and he's coming back to fight the case. Now, an agent of the federal government was heard to remark that they were watching O'Hare for fear he might try to leave, and that he necessarily had to leave from a different airport. Furthermore, they had traced him. He went to Miami, the Bahamas, London, Paris, and Switzerland. That's hardly a direct flight from Chicago. His lawyer has filed a claim against him for nearly $12,000 in unpaid legal fees. Now, how about the others? The other Durovic is also has a tax lien against him. How about Ivy? In 1957, it was brought up that in this trial that he had in 1 year deposited $157,000 $172,722. Now, in case any of you aren't aware of that, college people don't make that kind of salary. Even if they're vice presidents, they don't make that much. And when Ivy was asked about this, he said, oh, well, that was the year I sold a lot of stocks. So somebody was not being quite satisfied with it, ran down the stock broker who had handled his account and said to see if he could find out. Yes, indeed, Dr. Ivy had some stocks, and he had sold some that year. But he ordered me to reinvest the money immediately, so he didn't have any put in the bank from that source. But that was his excuse. Well, I got to get to a conclusion. You notice I have left out chiropractic. Somebody brought that out this morning. Dr. Spears and others do. Well, Spears did, but chiropractors, as you've heard, do claim sometimes to be able to cure cancer. If I have done anything for you here, as I would hope to have done, I hope I've reinforced your feeling of a need for a real healthy skepticism about these things. I hope that if it could be, I've reinforced your realization of the need to distinguish between the legitimate and the quack, and to teach your kids and friends, the rest of the public, how to do it. That gets to the question, what do you have as a rule of thumb that might help to distinguish between the legit and the quack? I'd like to suggest that there are 4 things you can do and tell people to do too, a lot more effectively than it's usually done today. You may be the exception. But I would say, first of all, learn to read and listen carefully. I don't want to say that a certain toothpaste is a quack job, but it makes a good illustration of careless listening and reading. You may remember that some years ago a brand came on the market, and you can find plenty of people today, just go out and do your own little Gallup poll, who will say that if you only can brush your teeth once a day, use this brand. And they'll swear it's advertised that way. You read the ads, they do not say that. No, I didn't say that quite right. I said what I quoted the ad. That if you use this toothpaste, people think that it says if you use this toothpaste, you will not have to brush more than once a day. They say if you only can brush once a day, then they recommend that because it lasts with you, stays with you. And of course, I guess the real reason I go out and do these things is to get in my commercial for my pharmacist. I would say as a second thing, you ought to consult the pharmacist. He's the most available, the scientist on the corner. He doesn't charge a consultation fee. His real function, which even he hasn't often recognized, seems to me, is to act as a drug consultant. Is he qualified? Well, he has the longest, most technically based course in pharmacology of any health profession, about twice the length of the medical and dental profession. So the young pharmacist could and should be your drug consultant. And he can tell you from other things he's had whether some devices and machinery are apt to be any good. If you're not satisfied with him, of course, the Food and Drug Administration, the Better Business Bureau, the American Cancer Society have offices that will try to answer questions. So, I'd start with the pharmacist, or my consulting friend, as my second category. A third thing I do to help distinguish between these quacks and legitimates is to shun the guarantee and the testimonial. I showed you one guarantee. The testimonial is even more insidious. I'm sure that you will never see any record or hear me on the air endorsing the engineering aspects of the Cadillac. General Motors is not going to be crazy enough to hire me to make such a statement, because I'm not an engineer. Think of it that way and realize how ridiculous it is then when we listen to our neighbors who are completely unqualified to advise us in matters of health. Had a colored girl at our house the other day tell me about using bacon to take a splinter out. I said, how about the infection that goes with it? Oh, no, you won't have any trouble that way, Dr. Kaufman. I said, you take your splinters out your way and I'll take mine out my way. Guarantees and testimonials are usually made testimonials by people who are not competent judges, the guarantees by shysters. And then I'd reject these claims of suppression. These folks who say, as the Kerbazin people have so much, oh, the medical trust is trying to beat us down because we have something too good. That's a lot of malarkey. And every time you hear that claim, you should be extremely skeptical, as Montgomery mentioned this morning. Now here are a couple others. This was the Alcoa class of Dr. Albert Abrams. He was an MD out in San Francisco, and underneath that there's no particular value. Most of the things he sold weren't even wired up underneath, except the parts to make a light flash or grow dim or bright. And one of his disciples, unintentionally I'm sure, was a woman chiropractor by the name of Ruth Drown. And she also operated mainly out of California. And this, Abrams thought of it first, but this was a more modern version. That little cup there, that little well, was to receive a sample of dried blood on paper, cotton, whatever you have. You could even mail it across the country. She'd put that in there, twist the dials, and take a reading that would give her the diagnosis and the suggested treatment. They inveigled her into doing this, making this demonstration in Chicago some years ago, and she came up with the idea that with the diagnosis. Oh yes, and she could even tell the approximate age and sex of the patient by all this hocus pocus. And she came up and reported after some consideration this was an elderly lady who was dying of a complication of cancer and tertiary syphilis, I believe it was. And the young fellow who was in the group watching a demonstration started to snicker, and she said, "What's so funny about that, young man?" He says, "Well, I'm that old lady. That's my blood." Well, of course, you know the atom bomb made everybody conscious of radiation. Here's the atomic pillow. They have atomic blankets. Must be awfully uncomfortable. There was a chicken farmer up in Wisconsin who took an unused hen house and lined it with a lot of low-grade uranium ore and put some benches in there and charged the suckers $10 an hour to sit in there and get the healing radiation. Cured everything, as long as it lasted before the Federals got him. But it updated the quackless science. And here's another fairly new one. This is a little box with an induction coil. You moisten your arm, you put one probe there, you take off your shoe and put your foot on this thing. This gives you a little extra ritual, see, and instead of having it come all through there, you got to make one contact through there. They called it the magnetron, sold it for $250, and claimed in their promotion that it would do for the chronic diseases like cancer what the antibiotics had done for the acute infectious diseases. Here is one of the publications of the health groups, and I use this page to get you this number 10. Carbiazin is not creatine. They're not going to take that line down. This was, I think, about a 1966 issue, 65 or 6. I don't see it on there. And here's the Apostle of Compost Heat, his magazine Prevention. Is insulin a cancer breakthrough? Well, he, like many of those people, he picks up little statements and comments on them. Incidentally, Rodale's written a couple of real useful reference books like Phrase Finder and the Word Finder, but he is not trained in any phase of science so far as he's ever claimed. Here's something you can get from the cancer people, unproved methods. Every issue of this CA, a Cancer Journal for Clinicians, has a page or so like that. And they're glad to send you these reprints. Also, I have another book. Here, I'll show you. This research in physiopathology is illustrative of another thing. Dr. Ravici wrote, that's his book, $24 a copy list. And of all people, John Wiley and Sons published it for him. I don't know whether he was blackmailing the editors or what. And that, as the preacher said after a real long-winded sermon, if the gentleman in the back will turn on the lights and open the window and let this hot air out, I'll quit.